I'm going to talk today about a project that is in progress. I work with Luke Hodgson from the state of Maryland, and we are trying to develop a systems dynamics-based decision support tool for the optimal deployment of assets for a mass casualty event. And so I want to acknowledge Luke because he's important and vital to this. I know how to do the modeling, but he knows all the inputs that I have to put into the models, and many of you will know that stuff as well. So what is systems dynamics, and why is it important? So what we try to do is develop mathematical models of complicated systems with the goal of capturing the essential ingredients of those systems so that we can predict the future. It's all about trying to predict the future. So we care about it because a model, if properly constructed, can support decision making and become a tool, that you would use. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of that just to give you a notion of where it came from. I had a whole bunch of sample applications, but I'll just allude to those, and then I'll talk about the application to emergency response. So this all came about. It's an interesting story about Jay Forrester, who was an engineering professor at MIT. And Alfred Sloan decided that the way business was being taught in the country was not capturing the technical disciplines. And so Sloan gave a huge chunk of money to MIT and said, I want you to start a business program at MIT. And Jay Forrester was one of the first faculty members in that business program. And he just decided, what the heck am I going to do as an engineering professor in a business program? And so we model things all the time. That's what we do. We design things, and the only way we can design them is if we have a model of those things, and so we can predict the response of them. So Forrester brought his engineering knowledge to the business domain and developed the entire field of systems dynamics, which is what he ended up calling it. And he has written a number of books which are shown here, and was invited by the Club of Rome to work on the problem of what are we going to do about global population increase in food supply. And so he developed a huge number of models. There's 256 equations in the systems dynamics models that are used as input equations to help predict where things are going to go. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this. Now, there's a lot of stuff on the internet when you look at systems dynamics where they include these things which are called causal loops. So this is an example, by the way, of technology adoption, where you have a big population of people who are potential adopters of technology. And when you start a new company, you want to convert all of those people into adopters. And so you're trying to identify what are the things that we can do to take people from potential adoption to actually using our technology. And so you try to come up with equations that capture things like, in this instance, you'll see on the right side we have word of mouth. On the left side we have a negative feedback loop called market saturation, and we convert that stuff into what's called a stock and a flow. So we have this stock of potential adopters, and we're trying to increase the flow so that we can get them to adopt our technology as quickly as possible. This is a basic, simple model of systems dynamics. And you would like to know over time how quickly people will be buying your stuff, for instance. The same sort of models are used in pandemics, by the way. So the bottom line is what you want to be able to do is write equations that allow you to build computer simulations that you can then use to predict potential futures. Because if you can predict potential futures, then you can plan for them. I taught critical infrastructure protection, the best class in the Homeland Security program. And one of my former students was Luke Hodgson, and Luke came to me and said, look, I want to develop some quantitative models some ways of measuring how we might respond to a mass casualty event, and then how might we respond better to that mass casualty event so that we reduce the number of fatalities. And that is a perfect sort of setup for what's called the systems dynamics model. And so what you have in this case for the emergency response, let me get back to why it matters to you. A decision support tool helps you best deploy your assets to minimize the number of fatalities. And by the way, I'm writing all of this in Excel because everybody has Microsoft Office. And so once the tool is fully written, you can run it in Excel. And it can help you make decisions. Ultimately, look, what you'd really want to be able to do is you would want to be able to say, look, here's how many response vehicles I have. Here's how many people I have. Here's where the event is. Do we have good situational awareness on what the event is? And then, okay, how can I best deploy those assets to minimize casualties? That's what we're trying to build, a model of that sort of system. And so that's a time-based system because it's time critical. You got to take people from the event to healthcare. All right, so we have some mass casualty event, and Luke is disabusing me in some ways on what actually constitutes a mass casualty event, so it's something that overwhelms what your resources are. It doesn't have to be gigantic, but it just has to overwhelm your resources. So you have some event, you have people, that's this little icon down in there. You have emergency response vehicles, and you have healthcare facilities. We have to assess the event, send resources to the event, and we have to transport those people to healthcare facilities. And we want to model all of that. We want to model the asset deployment to the event, the triage at the event, and then the transport from the event to the hospitals. Then add the piece, we aren't there yet, we're just at the responding to the event part. Then we want to add the piece of what happens in the hospital system. And you want to try to identify the things that are slowing down the throughput. And you want to be able to fix the things that are slowing the throughput of casualties through this system. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the first part of this. So in the systems dynamics approach, what we're trying to do is simply take a number of casualties, and we want to transport them, and then those people are treated, and they are either recovered or removed. Removed is a nice way of saying they died, so I apologize for that, but that's just the way it goes. You know what this is like. You all do emergency response. And so we have to write equations that tell us, hey, as a function of time, how many people have we transported? How many people have recovered or died? We want to know all of those things. And we also want to, when we're talking about the casualties, we want to come up with a severity scale for those casualties so that we can have some notion about how much time those people have before they have to be treated. Because that's going to affect how many fatalities we have. So I'm going to go through some of these things with you, and of course you're welcome to ask questions anytime anything comes to mind, by the way. So what we're dealing with is a number of pieces of this overall puzzle, which include in the first bullet point here, what is it? How big is this situation? We have to have decent situational awareness or we don't have any idea how many assets we need to deploy. So where is the event, how large is the event, and how severe is that event? And so we need to come up with a distribution of severity for a given casualty size. That's going to depend upon the event that occurred. As you know, we of course have to get assets to the event as well. And time's wasting when we're doing that. And then when we get to the event, we have to decide, are we going to triage? Or are we just going to start transporting people? Because it takes time to triage. So we want to know we want to deploy assets. How many assets do we need? Where do they come from? And we're going to need network models of response flow in order to do that. So we have systems dynamics models, and then we have these network models that represent transportation systems and represent the hospital healthcare systems. So we're developing models for those things. And also I work with Ryan Ford from the city of Philadelphia on fatality modeling. So we want to come up with a notion of how many fatalities do we expect for a given type of event, so a particular threat vector on a particular population size. And that geometric location of that thing is going to affect your response as well and going to affect casualties. So you can already see that there's going to be a lot of inputs to these models and that we've got to get the inputs right. So I can build models all day long and they can have nonsense inputs. But if I build them sufficiently robust enough, you can educate me on what the inputs really need to be, and then we can fine-tune those models. So Luke is really helping with that. He should be on the line, in fact, if anybody wants to ask him any questions. Okay, so the next thing is, do we want to prioritize? I have to prioritize the transporting of patients. That is triage, man. And you know that the time it takes to triage is going to depend upon how many people you have and how good they are at triage. So do you just show up at the event and just start taking people? Which is what a natural inclination happens to be. Oh my God, let's get them out of here, get them out of here, get them out of here. Or do we triage, and do we take the time to triage? And how important is that? And then, of course, the other systems dynamic problem is what happens at hospitals. And this is a huge problem because you know that we're taking people to the hospitals. They don't necessarily have the capacity to be able to handle all the people that we would be taking. And then you also know that Good Samaritans will be taking people to the hospitals as well, which can really cause problems clogging up the flow of people at the healthcare side of this. Okay, so this is basically what it's going to look like. We have an event somewhere, and we have vehicles at different locations at different distances from those events. And so we have to get those vehicles to the location, all of which takes time. We have to get people to the location and do triage, which takes time. And then we have to transport those to different healthcare facilities. So there are time-based systems dynamics inputs in each and every one of these components. Is this all making sense to you, what's going on here? Until I model it, it's easy to talk about it, but you got to build the stinking models, which is the hard part. And so I built a bunch of models, and one of the input panels on my Excel spreadsheet contains little things like this. So I have a model inputs panel that says, okay, how big is the event? How many casualties do we have on site? In this particular case, I have 400. And then I have a severity scale. We want to assign red, yellow, or green to the severity of the injuries of each of the patients. And so in this particular case, I have as inputs that of those 400 people, 15% will be considered severe, red category. 20% are in the yellow category, and 65 are in the green. So it's like, okay, what do those categories mean? So I have to assign values to the red, the yellow, and the green. And so what I do to assign values to those is I have a time to treatment requirement. So I use statistical distributions of injury severity to determine how much time a person has before they would die. So I assign values for those things, and then you as a user have input over all of this. There are drop-down menus for each of these input items, including how many small response vehicles do you have, how many people do you have available for triage, how much time does it take per patient to do the triage, how many large response vehicles, I have 0 in this case, what's the capacity of the large and the small response vehicles, and how far away is the event. And so if I have resources coming from a number of different locations, right now all I'm doing is using an average time to get there, all of them. Because the model gets very big when I account for the time, the travel time for each and every vehicle. It's better off at this point to just use averages. So that's one of these inputs that I'm using. And then it provides an output for you. It does a calculation where it says, okay, we expect that if you do not do triage for this particular event severity profile, 400 people, that we're going to lose 74 people. If we do triage, we'll lose 44. So you need to understand how the heck I'm assigning these things, right? So that's an important model input, and you can. So this is what the spreadsheet looks like. I don't expect you to understand all of this stuff, but what I do is simple. I assign a number of casualties in the spreadsheet, and then I give those patient numbers. And then I use a statistical distribution to assign the percentages red, yellow, and green. And for red, what I'm saying is you have at most 60 minutes to get them treated. For yellow, it's between 60 and 240. And for green, I just came up with a large number, 3,000 minutes. So the green patients are not that bad. So then what you decide to do is you say, okay, if I'm just going to do random transport, I just show up and grab the first patient and take him. Just randomly transport based upon the number of vehicles I have. And if you do that random transport, if you look at the second column on that sheet says random time available. So that random time available is how much time is required for them to receive care before they would expire. And so if you're randomly transporting people, there's going to be a random number down there, but it's going to fit the categories, 15% red, 20% yellow, the rest of them green. So I hope this makes sense to you. Now, if we do triage instead, we order these patients according to red, yellow, and green. So we take the time to evaluate all 400 people, and we assign them red, yellow, and green. And then based upon those assignments, we transport the red patients first, the yellow second, and then the green. So does all of that make sense to everybody? What's going on in here? Okay, so that's how the model is working. So you'll notice something like, okay, patient number 1 had 8 minutes. Patient number 2 had 23, 3, 26. Patient 5 had 5. You know, so all of those, these are the red patients. They all have less than 60 minutes. But I don't know, I don't have perfect knowledge of how much time each person has. I just have the bins of red, yellow, and green. And then I start to transport those people. So what happened for this person that had 8 minutes, I took so much time to triage that they died on site. Okay? So I had I had minus 19 minutes, meaning less than 0, so they've died. To get them to the hospital, minus 23, so they're a death on scene. Okay? Hopefully that makes some sort of sense to you what's going on. And that's the difference between just randomly taking them versus doing triage. You lose patients during triage. So you have to ask yourself, what are the event conditions that justify triage? So this tool allows you as a user in the first bullet to set the casualty size. Based upon situational awareness, you know the distance to the event location. And so given the road conditions, you know the travel time, so you know how long it takes to get there. You can deploy your response vehicles. How many do you want to deploy? You have to set the event severity, which is going to be based upon fatality models. And then the tool assumes our average arrival time and compares random transport to triage ranked transport. This just shows a number of event severity scales that you can choose from. You can make it, you can input any numbers that you want, but this is just a drop-down menu that's in the input panel that allows you to choose event severity scales. You'll notice that I have on the top 5% in red, 10% in yellow, 85% green, not a particularly severe event, down to a super severe event where everyone's red and yellow. So on the user panel, you can choose that as well. So here's an example, by the way, of a comparison of the number of fatalities with and without triage as a function of the number of response vehicles. So on the vertical axis is the number of fatalities for this particular event. On the horizontal is the number of response vehicles you have. The yellow line, this one here, is fatality count with triage as a function of number of response vehicles. The blue line is random transport. So you'll notice that I have a bunch of severity conditions up here. I have 400 casualties. I have 15, 20, and 65 as my severity. I have 30 triage personnel, which is kind of a lot, 2 minutes per patient to triage, and the event is 4 minutes away on average from our response vehicles. And so you'll notice for a small number of response vehicles, down in here, less than 5, a little less than 5, that triage doesn't pay off. Random transport is the way to go. So if you don't have a lot of assets, just get there and start taking them. Get them the heck out of there. But triage begins to pay off as your transport vehicle number increase rises. And then it plateaus and crosses yet again when you get above 30 transport vehicles. So, look, the number of fatalities you would expect depends, of course, upon how many casualties there are to begin with, and then the severity of the event, and then the number of vehicles you have. And it would be nice to know, given the number of vehicles and the event severity and the casualties, should I put my time into taking personnel to do triage, or do I just start picking people up and transporting them? Okay, this is another example. The orange are always with triage, fatalities with triage. The blue is always just show up and start randomly transporting. This is showing for the conditions listed above the graph. So I have, again, I'm sticking with 400 casualties. I have 10 transport vehicles, 20 people for triage, 4 minutes per patient for triage, and it's 10 minutes away in this case. And now I'm just using an event severity scale number. Think of this as we're increasing the number that are in red, by the way. Okay? And so you're going to notice something is that for relatively low severity events, for the conditions that are above the graph, you're better off just a random transport than to do triage. If you have only 10 vehicles. But if you increase the number of vehicles to 20 on this graph, then triage pays off until the severity scale goes above what I call 7 in this case. So if we can get the models right, it helps you make decisions. Instead of just gut reaction decisions, if you get it right, you do the drop-down menu, you say, okay, here's how we're going to deploy our assets. Furthermore, when you start to get the model right, if you know how many vehicles you have, how many people you have, how many qualified triage personnel you have, you can run an optimization to determine the optimal deployment of those assets to reduce the number of casualties. Look, of course it depends on if you've got the event severity right.
Tom, we have a couple of questions on chat.
You do? I got 29 minutes left, so ask away.
What metrics are being used to identify or clarify risk associated with threat vectors which may result in a mass casualty event? Is this only for a hostile act which results in mass casualties, or for any event? Well, and how do you link that to the population density or anticipated density?
Okay, So that's where the fatality models piece of it comes in. So you have to determine for a given population density and a given threat vector that is occurring against that population density, the number of casualties you would expect. So in this case, I have attack fatality models, but they're not fed into this program yet. You're seeing the early phases where we're trying to develop the framework of the model to develop a decision support tool, so it's not all in there yet. So I hope that answers that question. They should chat with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If it's thumbs down, tell me after. Yes?
I'm curious if your decision-making model ever took into account the incident in Nevada, the big shooting that took place.
Yes.
And what did you find? And I'll say what I found interesting was the fact that Siri led most patients to, as Uber drivers were picking them up to a community hospital that was not equipped to handle these patients, then by causing secondary transfers to Trauma 1, which was just the other way by like a half mile.
No, look, everything you're saying is really important. So the attack fatality model that I developed with Ryan Ford came up with a very close estimate of the number of fatalities we expect from that event, by the way. We compared it to that event. I do not yet have in this model the targeted transport to level 1 trauma facilities. It needs to be, right now it's just the response piece. We're picking people up and we're taking them somewhere. I haven't yet decided where. Of course, we got a couple of things that we have to deal with. That is that Good Samaritans just show, people drive themselves, all of that stuff that just clogs the system. And then we would really also like to know, hey, if I got a green patient and they're like freaking out and they need to go somewhere, we're going to send them really far away so that we don't clog the local level 1 trauma facilities. So that's all designed to go in there, but it's not in there just yet. Other questions?
Does this model apply to agencies of all sizes?
Yes. Yes, because you have control over the inputs. So if you only have one response vehicle, then you'd use the drop-down menu and say, I got one response vehicle. And then, look, where it gets complicated is if you're relying on mutual aid, then the time to arrive of maybe some other jurisdictions could be really large. You might have a few vehicles with short arrival times and then a large number of vehicles with long arrival times. And right now, all I'm doing is taking an average of those things in the arrival time. I hope that helps.
Do you see this tool for pre-planning or heat of the moment? Any difference?
Both. I think heat of the moment is the real value. But pre-planning, the problem with pre-planning is you're always going to have to justify what your threat vectors are, like, because you might want to plan for the worst case scenario, and then that could cost a lot of money to have, what it's like, everyone. Surge capacity is not something anyone wants to pay for. So okay, maybe. Whoever the emergency, the tool would be available at the emergency response center, and then you would have, that's the person who's coordinating all of that. I hope that makes some sense to you.
From far away in an FDOC or a far away area or OEM instead of
as long as they have good situation.
And the coordination between that, it's just never going to work.
This
is great for pre-planning, I could see that, or for an exercise or simulation. I don't see this really working in the on-scene dynamic situation that's happening when you have multiple entities. And we're also assuming, from what I can see with the model, is that there's nothing else going on in the city or the area that might already be impacting those hospitals or those trauma centers.
No, we would know, okay. So the model would have to have all of those inputs about how many beds are available, how much capacity is available. There are network models that are pretty good to determine if parts of your infrastructure have been damaged, how does that affect your response times and your deployment of resources? So look, this is, it's up to you to decide whether or not you would like to use something like this. I think it should be tailored. Whatever it takes, it should be tailored to be a real-time response tool. Then it has huge value.
I do see the value in this when you first started talking is in special event planning.
Yeah.
And also, it would be valuable for me for budgetary reasons, so that I could take a historic event and show if we had a different number of resources, but I now have something that I can actually show how it would have a real time or an actual impact on the incident. So it would be valuable to me for different reasons. Not just the real time, although it would be, what you're targeting at.
Well, I'm happy it would be valuable for something other than, I always want it to be a real-time support tool, but I'm glad it would have value in other ways. And the great thing is, if you're doing budget planning, the tool should be able to come up with an answer that's similar to what you experienced. So you got to be able to calibrate the tool, or the tool is bullshit, okay? So I don't want nonsense tools. I want things that are useful. So your input is very important in all of this. Okay, this is just a complicated graph that has so much on it. But what it is showing is the number of people available for triage for a given event size, time to triage, number of response vehicles, red, yellow, green. So I'm trying to compare all the same sort of events and then show as we increase the number of vehicles, the y-axis is always fatalities. Of course, the number of fatalities is going to go down. And then you'll notice this sort of, there's an interesting bump in here, but there's an exponential drop, a power law drop as a function of number of people for triage. So there's sort of a diminishing return beyond a certain point. Keep throwing more people at it, you don't get a huge return like you get early on. This is an interesting comparison. Remember, the blue is just random transport, and the yellow is with triage. This upper line here, blue, this is showing as a function of travel time to the incident. How far away is the incident? And so you'll notice that for the situation that I have up in this upper panel, which is pretty much what I've talked about many times, but I have 30 people available for triage, which is quite a lot, and 20 ambulances, that for those inputs, triage pays off when it's, triage does not pay off when it's really close, 2 minutes away. Then it pays off for quite a while, and then it crosses over again. Once you get beyond 25 minutes away, it's like, okay, forget it. You've lost all your advantage of triage, given the number of people you had and the time you had. So hopefully it makes you think about all of these things. And then changing the number of people for triage. So in this case, I'm comparing two scenarios with different travel times. So travel time to the incident is along the x-axis, fatalities along the y-axis. And in one case, I have 10 people for triage on the right, and I have 30 people for triage on the left. We had a huge payoff of triage on the left graph, but none on the right. So there was no distance for which, when we had only 10 people for triage, the triaging before transport paid off. That's an interesting result. Yes? Well, go do that. I want to hear that. Go ahead.
Will this eventually be automated, and will it have an algorithm also built in that this, can evolve naturally based on your inputs?
Oh, wow. Automated is, you still need to, situational awareness has to be able to report something. And so you got to be able to report how many casualties and how severe it is. So those are inputs to the equation. I mean, maybe in some future where you have drones constantly running around, it does all that automatically. I don't know. But you're getting into the realm of AI and sort of sophisticated computational algorithms, which would be cool, but I'm not thinking about that just yet. I'm not sure. We could not host it on an Office platform if we were going to do that. It would have to be a different set of software to enable that sort of thing. Are there any other questions?
We had a question as to whether the model takes into consideration that hospitals have their own triage protocols.
Not right now, because remember, there are several pieces to the model. There's this sort of emergency response piece to the model. There's the transportation network piece to the model, and then there's the hospital piece of the model. And I'm just starting the hospital piece now. It's not in there yet. And you need good information in order to do that. And you need participation of people who would be interested in doing that. I don't know if we'll be able to get that.
There was a recommendation of engaging the local EMS folks and hospitals that could then plug in the real-time information for you to run scenarios.
This is what I use. Well, Luke, if he's somewhere online, he probably has 20 answers already to these things because he guides me. The other thing is I want to be able to look at fatalities as a function of time. And you'll notice that this is a sort of strange looking graph where you're like, what are these huge horizontal bars? And it has to do with the fact that the orange is, remember, with triage. The blue is fatalities without triage, so that's random transport. We end up, because we organize the triage patients into red, yellow, and green, we get deaths during transport. And so for any given transportation time phase, that's what all this time is. This is fatalities on the y-axis against time on the x-axis. That we get a lot of fatalities early on because of the time that was spent in triage. And then eventually, as a function of time, the triage can win out so that your total number of fatalities is lower. But there's always going to be a functional form that looks like this, that there is a price to be paid for triage. Okay, so there's another part of this, and that is the asset deployment is a shipping problem. So this, again, is a part of the tool where you say, okay, I have X number of vehicles at location A, another number at B, another at C. I got to get those things to the event. They have to travel over a transportation network that might be damaged. If I ask for 25 vehicles, what is the best route and locations to get those vehicles from? It becomes what's called the transshipment problem. We're trying to get things from one place to another. And so we use well-established shipping models to do that sort of thing. And then it becomes another shipping problem from the site to the healthcare facilities, the level 1 trauma centers and so forth. And we have to make sure that we do not overload them. And that these facilities are going to have a capacity that varies as a function of time. So throughout the event, we would like to know situationally, can they accept, they were full 15 minutes ago, can they accept 4 more right now? So that becomes the whole systems dynamics problem. And that's where I think it would be really valuable as a real-time tool. Again, but I don't have, this piece over here is not modeled yet. All right, you're seeing something we just started in August, so we got a long way to go. The other thing is, of course, there are ways of using network models. Look, it would be kind of stupid of me. I mean, I can build network models for transportation systems, but Google is way better at it than I am. And so it doesn't make sense to do any of that. But that, again, is a network. And you're trying to get things from one place to another. Say, I have these 2 orange nodes in here. We're trying to get from this is node 8 to node 18. Or is that, I can't read that from here. 6 to 18. And you want to know that the time required to get it there, well, Google's really good at doing those sorts of things. And if you have an event that damages the transportation network, they have to take different paths. And so the time is going to change. But this sort of network model can also be used, by the way, to model patient flow through a healthcare facility. And I am hoping to be able to do that as the next piece of this puzzle. Model the healthcare piece. The goal is to model the event size, severity, response, vehicle flow, triage, and finally treatment, all of it. We want to model all of these pieces so that we can overall reduce the number of fatalities. Yes?
So thank you for this. I love this concept and the way you've put it all together. Just a couple thoughts. I was the Route 91 incident commander in Las Vegas. So I spent about 19 hours in that lot from the time the event unfolded and saw it all the way through to the next day. Just a couple thoughts for consideration. There's multiple gates and ways that first responders and medical can get into that lot. And there's no way we could have predicted where people would pick up patients. Patient triage in a lot that size is almost impossible, because here's what happens. You have 800 victims. 800 people have been shot or taken shrapnel or been stompled to death. There's just no way to triage them in a organized, categorical fashion in which you're presenting, which I love the concept. But the problem is some of them were shot and didn't realize they were fatally shot, so they left the lot and walked a block or a mile, and then they died. The amount of people that picked up patients on the streets, the Good Samaritans that you referred to, we had ambulances log on that weren't logged on, that would come and transport patients that weren't actually logged on. We had cops come that were out on the strip that were transporting, cops from other cities. So it was very hard for us to track patients. As a matter of fact, we couldn't track them. The ghost calls that came in up and down the strip, when we were there, we thought we were under siege like in Mumbai, India. The amount of ghost calls that happened because injured patients would leave and go to a neighboring hotel and say, there's an active shooter. When they would call in, they would say, oh, there's an active shooter at the Tropicana. There's an active shooter at the Excalibur. So by the time that medical was arriving, we thought we had 12 to 17 active shooter events unfolding simultaneously. So that pulled our resources. So the ambulances then were pre-deploying to the other hotels in order to respond to the active shooter events there. So there was just no way for us to keep them organized in that fashion of self-deployment. So what we've done to combat that, or to make sure in the future we have a plan, is we are deploying, like we deployed a captain to every hospital to deal with the overconvergence of resources and to also keep the chaos that would unfold when people weren't getting treatment to a minimum. So we now have that as a pre-deployment plan ahead of time, because there is no way to divert people to specific hospitals. The other thing is, and something it's hard to put into a model, I like the idea of pre-planning. We plan between 120 and 220 events a week, so we do pre-plan. The problem is sometimes we don't think maniacally enough. And Stephen Paddock was not crazy, he was not on drugs, he was not bipolar, and he wasn't dying of cancer. There was really nothing for us to put him in a nice organized box, right? We just didn't think maniacally enough. So when we pre-planned, we planned for an active shooter, we planned for a VBID, we planned for all of those things, but never did we plan for what he did and how he did it. So sometimes it's hard to put that into a pre-plan, right? And to understand how many victims you could have. So I love the model and I love this concept, and we will definitely take it back to integrate. But there are those variables that we just can't quite wrap our hands around yet. And so I hope as you develop this model, you'll kind of think about those other things and help us come up with ways that we can pre-plan. Because I agree, in the moment it is difficult. But I will lean on my fire department friends, because they're much better at ICS than we are, and they're much better at kind of pre-planning in the moment. And I think that together, the true magic of this, what you're putting forward, is the collaboration between emergency management, police, and fire, because no single entity can actually pull this off alone. We have to kind of come in on it together.
Thank you. Thank you for all that.
Question on model building, more of like a procedural question. Were you able to take some situations, Las Vegas or other mass casualty incidents, and then model that? And then what did you get from that output? And then how did that change the model in the future?
So this particular model is not mature enough for that yet, by the way. But in Ryan Ford's thesis, we have the attack fatality estimator, and that was an independent model that was used to predict how many fatalities we would expect from casualties, I mean, from that sort of incident. And that was within 10%, which is kind of remarkable to me. I didn't expect that. So it's not mature enough yet. It hasn't even been a year, and it's just been since August, and so we're still trying to wrap our heads around all of the inputs to these sorts of things. So I'm not there yet. Of course, if it doesn't agree with past events, then I'm wrong. And I have to accept, if I can't figure out a rational, defensible way to make it right, then I'm just doing it the wrong way. That's possible. But I mean, you know, with the graphs, are you starting to see, some of it makes sense, doesn't it? It's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We experience things like that. Okay, right. Are there, yeah, we got a question over here.
I'm assuming each ambulance could take 2 patients.
Yeah.
Like I missed it if you said how many could go.
It's in there. I have 2 right now. You know, and I know that's not always the case. But so I have a drop-down number that you can change that.
So anyway, you could transport, you know, say 40 patients,
Right.
and if they're walking wounded, you could transport them further away because
Yes.
you have the time.
Yeah, Luke tells me that stuff. He's like, yeah, I'll send a bus out for 50 people to go and send them 30 minutes away. Yeah.
So anyway, that's just a factor I didn't see that you had.
Yeah, it's in there. I didn't put it in those graphs because the loading time required, there's all these little inputs that have to go into, I know how to put it in there, but it's, so let me just tell you that each and every one, when I show you those data points are for 100 Monte Carlo simulations of each of those scenarios. And so it kind of chugs along. The more I put in there, the longer it takes a laptop to solve the problem, for instance. And I get impatient, and so I keep some of those things simpler to see if the results make sense to me and to people who are out there in the field doing things. Any other questions? Look at this, 4 minutes, David.
I know. There's several things I think you've answered them. It's not mature enough yet, and I'm sure you have plans. There were suggestions about looking at fixed sites like a stadium where you know X amount of people that'll be there and run different types of mass casualty incidents and be able to factor that in. Time frames. You have a lot of interest of folks of using this as a tool back in their agencies and departments. Do you have a time frame for when you think the tool might be available?
I'll have to talk to Luke about that. I have to talk to him about that. He's made all this possible, and so I feel that Luke is my boss on this sort of thing, and I defer to my boss as to what time frame. I mean, he's already messing around with this particular part of the tool to see if it makes sense and to make sure that the program doesn't crash. You know, all that stuff. Does it actually bloody well work when 3 different people have the same inputs? It sure better give you the same answers, you know. So there's a lot of validation, program validation. I don't know when it'll be ready for prime time. It shouldn't be that long. The goal is to get a really good, usable model this year.
Well, certainly we're going to make the recording of your session available because I think there will be a lot of interest. We spend a lot of time working ourselves up about a lot of what-ifs and threats and things we're dealing with, but you're actually giving us a tool here, and that's very exciting. So when it's available, we'll certainly help you push that out to all the agencies and departments. So Tom, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for this.